Hello, we're going to talk about a special case of rounding of fives in science that does not quite occur in the math class. This only occurs if you're rounding off a five or a five that only has zeros behind it. If there's anything behind a five that you're rounding off, then it rounds up. So here's how it works. Let's look at this first example that I have on this for us here. So we are going to round the 0.088501 to the thousandths position. So I'm going to underline the thousandths position, which is right there, that 8, and then I'm going to draw a vertical line between the 8 and the 5. And now I look to the right of the of that 8 that I need to round off in the thousandths position, and I see I have a 5, 0, and a 1. That 1 behind the 5 disqualifies it for this special rule. So typical math rounding would apply here. So it would just bump the 8 up to a 9. Okay, let's look at the second example where we are to round 3.150 to the 10ths position. So I will underline the 10th position there, and then I will draw a vertical line after the 1. So I just look to the right of the 1, and I have a 5 and a 0. Well, that fits the special case because I'm rounding off a 5 or a 5 with only zeros behind it. So then we look to the number in front of the 5 that's being rounded off. If that's odd, then we bump up. So we're going to bump this 1 up to a 2, as we have right there. Now let's look at the third example. Here we're going to round 15.285 to the hundredths position. Well, let's underline the hundredths position. That is the 8. And I'm going to draw a vertical line after the 8. Now I look at this 5. Now it's a 5 with nothing behind it. Therefore, it does qualify for the special rounding rule in science. So now we look to the number in front of the 5. If it's even, then we do not bump. So therefore, the 8 stays put because it's even. All right. Now let's look at the next example. We want to round 24,500 to the thousands position. Let me underline the position that we're rounding to. That's the 4. Draw a vertical line behind the position we're rounding to. Now I want to look immediately to the right of that vertical line, and I have 500. Well, that fits the special rounding rule in science. So now I look in front of the 500 and I see a 4. Well, that's an even number. Again, I do not round up. I leave it as a 4. So we get 24,000. And our last example is written in scientific notation. Now, times, excuse me, let me go back here. Times e to the negative 5 is the same as times 10 to the negative 5th power, in case you didn't know that. Sometimes some calculators will use e, and I didn't have an option in typing this to use exponents. So I used e in place of, as you can see here, the e actually replaces the 10. Okay? So back to what we were doing with the rounding. So I need to focus only on this part, not the power of 10 part. So I have 3.1750. I want to round up to 3 sig figs. You see here, these are not necessarily a tenths, hundredths, thousandths position. I would have to reconvert this to what's called a floating decimal number and get rid of the power of 10 and put the decimal where it really belongs to figure out, those kinds of names for the positions. But 3 sig figs, I can see it's the first 3 numbers, and so I'm going to underline the 7 because that is the third sig fig. So now I look right to the right of the 7 and I see a 5 and a 0. Well, that fits the rounding rule for science. It's a 5 and a 0, and there's nothing behind that other 0. So it's perfectly on the fence is what I would call that. It's exactly halfway between 0 and 10. So about half of the time in science, whenever a number is like a 5 or a 5 with only zeros behind it, it's exactly on the fence. About half the time it gets rounded up, and about half the time it rounds down, depending on the number in front. such as the 7 being odd or even. Well, the 7 is odd, and the rule up here says that if it's an odd number, it is rounded up. 5 gets rounded up. So that rounds up to the 8, as you can see. All right. So that is gives you 4 examples of when the rule applies. So in 2 of the examples, here we had an odd in front of the 5. Here we had an odd, a 7 in front of the 5's getting rounded off. So it rounded up. But in these 2 examples, where the 5 and the 500 were getting rounded off, we had an even number in front of the 5, and the rounding up did not occur. It's what we call rounded down. And that will be the extent of this.